Hello, my name is Eli Stevens. This is for the criminology course from MTDA, Missoula. This is from Mr. Moudry. The date is January 18th, 2021. This is my final review, reflection submission for the criminology. I'll be going over Unit 1 now. So Unit 1 is CAUGHT, an introduction to criminology. The questions are, to what extent is crime in the eye of the beholder? And how can we learn the root causes of crime? So we learn later on in criminology about stigmatism and kind of the idea that each person, when labeled either as a criminal or as a felon, processes that differently than somebody who committed a minor crime and didn't get that label or has internalized that label. So crime can be interpreted differently from each standpoint of who it affected, how they benefited or were victimized because of this crime. For instance, the family that robbed a bank, that family was struggling, was in a hard place, and they needed the money, and so they found that the risk versus the risk factor was not great enough to sway their decision not to versus the reward, which was a new car for the daughter. I'm forgetting her name. And what can we learn about the root causes of crime? Following that example is that it's either need or economic gain, social gain, some sort of benefit that outweighs the risks or the consequences of being caught. Moving on to Unit 2, the body, the mind, and the soul of a criminal. The questions are, how has criminal behavior been explained in the past compared with how we understand it today? And what do we know about the relationship between crime and the human brain and body? I believe this was the unit we learned about phrenology. So I believe it is phrenology. Phrenology, it was the study of the facial scape and how it related to your personality. So, for instance, if a bodybuilder always touched their temple or some place on their head when they were doing some sort of activity that was associated with activity or physical prowess. And so the same thing applied to criminals. It was if you had, for instance, your forehead was larger than another's, that could be associated with more criminal behavior, more deviant behavior, something that was less normal or less than the norm and was associated with criminal behavior. Now we've changed our views on what affects criminals now. For instance, the lack of father figures or a complete household during the early years of childhood, economic stress, social stresses, and other factors that go into an early developing child, like brain damage, for instance. If these children or any individual that have experienced these events are at higher risks to become criminals or dip into criminal behavior. And so, following the idea that I just covered about stigmatism and how people who have been have internalized the stigmatism that they are a criminal or they are a felon will have internalized that label and internalized what that means to them and how they have been affected by that. So, for instance, this is a good example of some person who committed a small crime was convicted of that and has been called a criminal. And so as she is called that more and more, she internalizes it and says, oh, if I am a criminal, I'll show them what that means to be a criminal. And so this relationship between how people interact with themselves and how they have interacted with crime or how they've been affected by it. moving on to Unit 3, Society in the Spotlight. The first question is, to what extent do we live down to the expectations of others? Number 2 is, does being around people who commit crime make you more likely to commit a crime? And what is the relationship between stressors and crime? So, similar to what I just said, is that previous to that in Unit 1 or 2, is if there's social stressors or social quotas to say, or social some sort of social expectation to be met, people will be more likely to be affected by those, more likely to be wanting to live up to those standards that they've been surrounded by or they have been molded by. So if people are wanting to be or trying and actively influencing younger or more influential or more influenced populations like children, young teenagers, people who are trying to live up to those expectations, they're going to be more affected by these kind of standards. And so if people are held to a higher standard but trying to meet those social expectations, they're going to be more pressured into doing those and not being able to meet those higher expectations held by them by their parents or peers or colleagues that hold them to a higher standard. Continuing on, similar to what I just said, if you are being influenced at a younger age or when you are more able to be influenced, having people who are spotlights to you or kind of idols to you that are committing criminal behavior, you're going to idolize that behavior. You're going to be more influenced by that. You're going to be more molded by it, more wanting to achieve the similar standard that they have set, similar to what I just covered. So if somebody or if a group of people are influencing another population just by their behavior, either criminal, deviant, normal, formal, it's going to be influential on all groups or any groups involved that are influenced by that idolized group or population. And similar to what I said in the first point, the stressors between social stressors, economic stressors, the more pressure that is on a person, the more likely they're going to be put into a corner where they're going to act out or act deviantly to meet an expectation, meet a goal. For example, a jock wants to be able to bench more or squat more weight, and he's going to start taking either drugs or some sort of substance to meet that goal, and it's going to be either labeled as deviant or normal based on the population that he's been influenced by. And so if he goes into a competition and is exceeding those measures and is caught by using steroids, it's going to be criminal behavior now, because while he took steps to make that expectation that was held by the population he's influenced by, it was criminal behavior that was eventually the means to his end, the end to his means in that example. Moving on to Unit 4, Stop the Violence. Question 1 asks, why do people commit violent acts, and how can violence be prevented? I believe this is the unit where we covered prejudice, and prejudice is a huge reason why most violent acts happen, either against a minority or a certain population that is held to be less than normal or deviant in a way. For instance, LGBTQ members are commonly the victims of violent hate crimes, or religious members are commonly the victims of violent crimes that happen because they are a member of a deviant society. If they, for instance, the the church shootings that have happened in recent years by a person that was prejudiced against that. I can't give you a specific example, but look at any time in the past 3 years, there have been violent crimes held by a racist or prejudiced person who was acting violently in accordance to his beliefs that these populations were less than more normal and were deviant to his society, and committed a violent act against them. And how can violence be prevented? Similar to what I said earlier on, is that the population that you are influenced by, the social standards you're trying to meet, the social expectations that you hold yourself to, are going to be a huge influence on your behavior, your really anything. So for example, if you come from a family of engineers, you're more likely to go into an engineering field based on the social standards that have been set by your family. The same thing can go for prejudiced behavior. If I believe the example that was held in this unit was a man who was violent, was in a prejudiced group online, and was consuming that media and being influenced by that population, where he was molded into it and was meeting that social standard of prejudice against these groups. And to prevent that, it would be to try to educate these groups, try to engage them in a sense of community where everybody is engaged, everybody is equal, into the sense that that prejudice behavior is quote unquote doused down and less rewarded. There's less space for people to be racist, sexist, any way of prejudice against a population. If there's members of every population that are that are in a community together and have a sense of community where they're socially bonded, there's going to be less prejudice between those groups if they are in a community where they feel that they are no longer deviant and are all accepted and held to the equal measure or equal standards, where they're not going to be held as abnormal or alien. Moving on to Unit 5, CEOs, terrorists, and mafia bosses. Question 1, is what methods are used by political, economic, and organized criminals? So this is covering white-collar crime, which is exactly as it says, CEOs, mafia bosses, terrorists, is people who are at a higher level, either in violent acts, more economic gain, or more criminal behavior. An example of this is, I'll go down the list, a CEO who will commit a salami slice crime, which is, well, for example, the commonplace crime is a bank manager who makes very small individual withdrawals from dormant bank accounts that often go unnoticed, but at hundreds at a time, and export them into an offshore bank account, which eventually exponentially increases. Normally, this is the most common method of crime that goes unnoticed, is small amounts of money that is taken away from easily victimized groups and populations that are able to go unnoticed and unpunished. And normally, these crimes are very low risk, normally, or lower risk than normal crime, and very high rewards. For example, there was a bank manager busted a couple of years back who had withdrawn $1.50 from dormant bank accounts that had been left untouched for 20 years or so, and withdrawn in total a sum of almost $500,000, and was profiting off that money while going entirely unnoticed, and he wrote it off as security measures. and he was able to get away with this because of these salami slice crimes. Moving down to terrorists, these are, all three of the examples are at a much higher level in their crime, either economically, violently, or criminally, just on a new level than your everyday blue or green collar crimes. So terrorists, these are people who are actively trying to commit incredibly violent crimes by any means or any measure. For instance, 9/11 was to date, or not to date, but is one of the most sensationalized pieces of terror or attacks from a terrorist organization that left the nation and many nations just shocked. It was so damaging and so influential that everything we know today, like the Patriot Act, was in place because of it. These people, these organizations are an entirely new level of crime and criminal behavior that that is not always covered in day-to-day basis, or is more sensationalized than day-to-day crimes. And mafia bosses, the third example. I mean, look at from the popular movie The Godfather, the Corleone family. Is these families who have the population and groups of people who have banded together and organized themselves into a group of population that offers services, that commits not normally less violence but more criminal crimes, or more, I don't know how to say it, but more crimes than other organizations. So these families can be violent, but normally got their standing from the prohibition, bootlegging liquor, rigging casino games, gambling, drug importation. These organized groups that have sort of militarized, in a sense, where they are able to commit more advanced and more intricate operations and continue these operations to make economic gain or tactical gain over opponents, and normally these families would compete. And the second question is, what is the relationship between entrepreneurship and crime? Similar to the mafia family, is these were businesses and intricate operations similar to a business that was being run by a management held by a criminal family. I mean, look at the prohibition and these bootlegging operations. These were professional businessmen who were dealing with criminals who would legally, or not legally, but legitimately buy this liquor and then import it into the U.S. illegally. It's similar to what we do today, is where we import goods from other countries. Silks, spices, really whatever, textiles and things. We import those, and this was just it's similar to an entrepreneurship in the sense that it is organized and is run like an operation, but is professionalizing in illegal crimes. Moving on to Unit 6, hacking gone haywire and cybercrimes. Number 1, what are cybercrimes? These are crimes that are done via online resources, done over the internet. For instance, we were the victim of a cyber attack on our national security system by an organized group that was operating from the internet. The second question asks, how much of a threat are cybercrimes in our society today? On that note, very high. I mean, we were just a victim to one on an incredibly exponential level that we still haven't uncovered the entire depth of, and we don't understand it fully right now, but it is one that is, the threat of cybercrimes are a very real one, and one that we should be aware of in our society today. The third question asks, what do we know about people who commit cybercrimes? Similar to mafia families or mafia bosses, these are organized groups that operate in not legitimately or like a business or entrepreneurship. They operate in a method or ideology that affects multiple groups or affects a vast population, either for example, economic gain, scammers, people who run fake call centers who try to scam people out of money via Amazon gift cards, uh, people who like anonymous, people who are more violent and uh, much more tactically inclined, who are trying to make political awareness and political. They're trying to sway the population, not sway, but trying to inform the population of certain things in either illegal or I either illegal or otherwise methods, and these are organizations who are trying to achieve a goal, and by measures done behind a computer screen. These are normally pretty high reward versus low risk because these people are taking measures to protect themselves online and they're not in person committing crimes. They are just people who have set themselves up with a powerful enough computer trying to do whatever they can to achieve a goal. I think I've covered the third question, why do people commit cybercrimes, in that previous statement. Moving on to the fourth one, can cybercrimes be classified as rational or irrational? Irrational. I would that's a tough question because rational in the sense of they're relatively low risk for high reward, or irrational because they are at such a high level of operation. This is an international threat that have international cyber attacks that have originated from all over the world, all over the continent, targeting various adversaries. These people or these organizations are operating at a level similar to Unit 5's topic. It was these people are actively trying to achieve a goal at higher levels than your everyday blue to green collar crime. These people are not holding up gas stations with a gun. These people are infiltrating the U.S. security database or knowledge base and planting bugs to access information that was at national level protection. Moving on to the final two units. Unit 7, World of Hurt, Victimology. The first question is, excuse me. The first question is, what happens to victims of crimes? Normally, victims of crimes, depending on the crime, either internalize that thought is, I have been the victim of a very violent crime. I've been the victim of a crime that has hurt my sense of pride, hurt my sense of security. For example, my 8th grade PE teacher had her house robbed, and as she was describing it to us, nothing of value was stolen, nothing of incredible value was stolen of hers, but her sense of security, her sense of safety, and her sense of kind of how she slept at night was ruined. Every night she would sleep in the hallway between her kids because she wasn't prepared for coming home to her house wrecked. Her house just torn apart by intruders. The next question is, are some people more likely to be the victims of crime? Absolutely. people who live in less economically inclined areas, people who actively actively unable to protect themselves, unable to ensure their security, are more likely to be targeted by criminals via the lower risk, and versus the arguably similar reward. So, for example, we covered in this unit how if you're probably going to be targeted by somebody you actually know, somebody would you're more likely to be robbed by somebody or stolen from by somebody you know, and that is on various levels, from somebody sneaking $10 out of your wallet while you were using the restroom, then versus somebody breaking into your house knowing you're on a vacation and unlocking your safe. There's many levels of this, but there are some populations that are unable or less able to be ensuring their security or protecting themselves or protecting their valuables or property or whatever they have. And the third question is, excuse me, sorry. The third question is, what rights do victims have? They have the right to testify against the perpetrator, and they have the right to not meet them, to remain anonymous, or remain unseen in the sense. So these people are able to go in to seek safety and seek protection in exchange for a testimony, or in exchange for some sort of information that would help the investigation against the perpetrator. And they are entitled to protection either from the Witness Protection Agency, or I don't know if it's an agency. I think it's a program. But they have rights in the sense that they are able to protect themselves from their perpetrators from other sorts of crime or retribution. Unit 8, our final unit, was... I am so sorry. Unit 8 is prevent, punish, or make peace, responding to crime. And so the first question is, what strategies help prevent and deter crime? The second question is, how is rehabilitation evolving? So, following that second question, and the first one, is that preventing crime comes from a multitude of various influential sources. Either that being an increase in consequence, an increase in danger and risk would deter a criminal from committing a crime. For example, if there's police patrolling your neighborhood, there's going to be you're at less risk of someone breaking into your house than if you have a police officer at your door or by your house. Similarly, if it's a more known, or if it's a known well-armed household, and there's somebody who has armed themselves or taken measures to protect themselves and their property, there's going to be a higher risk for the criminal or the person trying to commit a crime against you, or than would be reward-wise. So it's falling back to our key theory, is that crime is committed by risk versus reward. And so if there's a higher risk versus a lower reward, most crimes are going to be prevented just by that. Just by not worth it, not worth the consequences, not worth the actual steps after from the crime. Following that that idea is that if there's a higher consequence of your crime, EX more for a fine, more money spent on more money you're fined, or higher jail time. There was an idea or topic covered by maximum minimums or maximum minimums, is that if every crime, number big or no, or how big or small, had a minimum sentence or a minimum consequence, the crimes would be less committed. So if every crime started at just a single year of jail time, most minor felonies, or crimes, or really petty crimes happened would be reduced because of that threat and higher consequence because of those consequences, or because of those punishments. And so deterring crime is similar to those consequences, but it starts we talked about early on about how you're influenced at an early age and how populations you look up to and idolize are influencing you or influencing people. If you are taking in more healthy ideals and more healthy behaviorisms and less deviant behavior, you're going to be a much less chance, or not chance, much less kind of risk of committing we'll go with risk of committing a crime than somebody who has not grown up with a full family, or not been influenced and kind of guided towards that better judgment, rather than they've just been adopting a theory that doesn't cover crime at all. For example, if a kid has been cutting class and taking kids' lunch money, and if that behavior isn't punished or influenced by a guardian, a parent, or idol, or peer that is taking care of that child, or is being that child's surrounding population, crime would be more deterred, or that criminal behavior would be less rewarded because of these consequences and these risks of somebody being able to punish you. For example, if a student notices a kid is cutting class and calls his parents, that kid is going to be punished, not severely, but punished because of his actions, and would later on down the road would be able to recognize that pattern and behavior, and would probably be less likely to relapse into that behavior and commit a crime. And so, how is rehabilitation evolving? There's a theory about less stigmatism, and we talked about stigmatism earlier, of less stigmatism towards criminals, and more, as I said earlier, a more sense of community with criminals or past criminals, people who have not been able to connect with a community or connect with a population, and have felt ostracized or felt these social stressors and pushed to commit a crime because they want to meet those expectations. And we talked about social expectations of a population that's influential to a person or another population. And so more of these ideas of how people can be more guided towards better thinking and better judgment is the current ideas, or the current leading ideas, of rehabilitation of criminals. And that is all 8 of our units covered. Thank you very much for having me this year for MTDA. I enjoyed criminology very much, even though I did at times struggle to keep up with the work, or technically be just technically competent. Thank you for having me, Mr. Mutri. It was a pleasure. Have a wonderful second semester.